Hey everybody, this is Joe Turner with the American Association of Municipal Executives, and I'm excited to announce the launch of our free job board. That's right, our job board is launching this week. It is absolutely free and is the only job board in America that is exclusively focused on executive and senior level recruitments in local government. So if you are trying to find somebody to fill your assistant director vacancy and above, post your job on our job board today. It's super easy. It's free, and you can find us at jobs.aame.org. That's jobs.aame.org. Our goal is to bring all the executive and senior level recruitments to one job board so you're not jumping to 10, 15 different job boards trying to find city manager recruitments all across the country. But in order to be successful, we need you to start posting your jobs there today. And again, it is absolutely free. So check it out, jobs.aame.org. This episode of the City Manager Unfiltered podcast is sponsored by Holbrook Asphalt. Maintaining your roads is one of the most difficult tasks for any city government. The good news is the secret to making it easier is only 3 letters: HA5. HA5 extends the life of roads and reduces the financial burden on your taxpayers. HA5 is an innovative pavement preservation treatment trusted by over 300 public agencies. It keeps good roads in good condition, reducing repair costs and saving taxpayer dollars. Join the hundreds of other cities making the smart choice. Choose HA5 for longer-lasting roads and a healthier budget. Learn more at holbrookasphalt.com/city. That's holbrookasphalt.com/city. Check the show notes for a link. All right. I'm Joe Turner, and this is the City Manager Unfiltered podcast, a podcast for city managers and other public sector executives. It is the most influential local government podcast in America, and I'm really excited to have my guest with me today. He is Kevin Phelps. He's the city manager for the city of Glendale, Arizona. He has previously served as a city council member for 8 years up in Washington. He's been on the county side as a deputy county administrator. He's been in the private sector, navigating the management of businesses. I just think he has a lot of interesting perspectives. Kevin, why don't you welcome yourself to the show and give a little background?
Well, thank you. I appreciate being on. And yeah, my background's a little bit unique, probably for some city managers, in that I spent really the first 20, 25 years of my professional career owning and operating my own businesses. And I was talked into the Chamber of Commerce back when I was living in Tacoma, Washington. They were hoping to get some business acumen on the council. I didn't know any better, so I agreed to run for office. And thank goodness they have term limits. And I served 2 terms with the city council there and learned a lot about government and really helped frame a lot of what I wanted to do down the road.
Awesome. Yeah. Good old Chambers of Commerce and trying to lasso people in there. Oh, man. So, Kevin, I really enjoy the fact that you have this private sector experience background. And I'm not saying that every city manager should have private sector experience, but I do find it refreshing when I have conversations with city managers who do have that private sector background, because I talk a lot about how it's significantly different. It's much different to sign the back of the check than it is to sign the front of the check, and I oftentimes feel that city managers and what have you don't put themselves in the shoes of the business community often enough and understand the nuances and the risk and the challenges and the factors that they face. And you and I, we met for the first time back in. Actually, let me back up for a second. So a year ago in December, I had to refresh my memory, Kevin. I went and looked at some emails. You sent me an email back in December that was very complimentary of the podcast and of me. I was blown away by it because you and I had never interacted before, and you were just. I mean, I was overwhelming. I was overwhelmed by what you had sent me, and something that I don't think a lot of city managers understand. I'm gonna sound a bit like a fanboy, but Kevin, when you get a message like that from a big time city manager, someone who's in a town the size of Glendale, 250,000 people. I mean, you have a NFL franchise. I mean, you're big time. You're a big league city manager. And when a small town city manager such as myself gets a message like that from one of his peers, it's pretty amazing. And I don't know if you and other large city managers truly understand the significance or importance of reaching out and communicating to other managers in smaller communities. So first of all, I want to say thank you for that, because I still remember to this day getting that email and being blown away by it. So thank you very much, Kevin.
Well, you bet. And if I can let you on a little bit of a secret, um, and I appreciate the comments about being a big city manager. I tell you, I have incredible respect for the city managers of smaller communities. It would scare me to death, I think, to sometimes have to step in and manage some of the smaller communities. So I don't believe size is important. I think it's a skill set, and I think some of the most skilled city managers that I've come across are managing in smaller communities. I have a large enough team to hide a lot of my flaws and a lot of my shortcomings and weaknesses, and you don't always get that when you're the leader of a smaller community.
That's correct. You don't get to hide anything, really. No, but but sincerely, that was an amazing email. You covered a lot of ground in that email, and I want to have you on the podcast for multiple episodes because there's a lot to unpack, and I won't get to the nitty gritty of that conversation here. But I really want to focus on your economic development experience in Bonafides because when we met for the first time in August, when I was doing the AAME barnstorming tour, you shared with me some amazing information about your success and the success of your team in Glendale. And I really wanted to unpack it because, we were talking about economic development and you and I seem eye to eye on many aspects of it. There's sort of this nature that, you know, when we talk about economic development in the public sector, it can sound really fluffy, really subjective, really vague, really nebulous. Like what's really happening here? And sometimes I think, economic development efforts are overblown in the sense that public sector staff gets too much credit for economic development when natural market forces were going to propel business to develop anyway. But I also think there's ways where public sector executives can move the needle and get things done on an economic development perspective. And so, during that conversation, Kevin, you said a lot of folks will talk about economic development, but it's very fluffy, very shallow, superficial conversation for a half hour. Very few people will have a meaningful, substantive conversation for hours on end. And we don't have hours on end to have a conversation, but I think we can get into it in significant detail here when we talk about economic development. And I don't know if I should steal the punchline or let you do it, but I guess I'll do it. I mean, you told me this amazing story about how you came to Glendale in 2016, and today your taxpayers are paying less in property taxes in raw dollars than they were 9 years ago. Is that correct?
Correct. So maybe just to set the foundation here, in 2014, the Wall Street Journal ran a story that said that only Detroit, Michigan had a worse financial balance sheet than the city of Glendale. And so, one, we were coming from an area of incredible challenges financially within the organization. And when I came in into my role, it was really solely focused on improving our economic status within the community. And it goes back to when I was in the private sector, I had a friend of mine who helped businesses that were failing, and he was a consultant. And what he did is he didn't help startups, but what he did is he worked with companies that at one time had been successful, but had fallen on hard times. And so one day at lunch, I was asking him about how he was very successful. I said, "What's your secret sauce?" And he kind of laughed. He said, "Kevin, if I told you my angle, you would think I'm ripping people off." He goes, "But I go on this one premise that there's not a single organization that I can't help fix if we don't have more money coming in through the front door." He says what happens is entrepreneurs start the company. They know their key clients. They make client calls. They get a little bit bigger. So they hire a salesperson, and then they get a little bit bigger, and then they hire a sales manager. And each step of the way, the senior leadership gets more removed away from their customer that actually brings the revenue in. He said, so what I do is I go into an organization and I take senior leadership and I focus them on the revenue side. And goes, and when we do that, they now have enough money maybe to buy new manufacturing equipment. Maybe they have enough money now to market or to hire the right people. But it all starts with having enough resources. So when I came to Glendale, it became very clear that we had to focus on increasing our revenue. Now, the easy way out is to raise
Is raise
taxes and
taxes. There
fees.
you go.
Yeah.
There you go. Yeah, that's
And
the classic.
so we didn't do that. And what I made it very clear within our leadership team that as the city manager, I'll be paying attention to a lot of elements within the organization. but I'm going to be putting a lot of my focus and energy and kind of efforts towards improving Glendale's economic situation within the here in the valley. And we've been very successful. I was blessed with a really good team, and we've had incredible success to the point that we've actually never raised our property levy rate in the since 2016 since I've been here. And so if you have a home that's worth 300,000 here in Glendale, you are giving Glendale today less money today than in 2016.
That's amazing. That's just amazing. So, Kevin, I want to push back a little bit on something, right? Because I've talked about economic development on LinkedIn a little bit, and maybe a little bit even tangentially on the podcast. I haven't done much economic development conversation on the podcast, but I've often said that if you can't manage X amount of money, then it's pretty naive to think that you can grow yourself out of your problems with economic development if you have X plus Y amount of money. So, you just a second ago you talked about, hey, we need to bring in more revenue obviously for the organization, but do you subscribe to this notion that economic development is this magic panacea that can cure all for communities across the country? Because I feel like this is where every city council wants to hire some city manager who's got some economic development rainmaker background, and somehow they're just going to make all the problems go away because they land a couple of big whales to bring some jobs into town. Am I mistaken on that?
No, I think that's it's a very valid point. What we tried to do is we focused on increasing our revenues, is not making our lanes wider. And that's one of what I see too often is we get as an organization gets more money in, they take on more projects and more initiatives. And so we were really clear that what we wanted to do was not add on new initiatives. Let's get our balance sheet and put us in a position to where we could make strategic investments and not be restrained by not having the resources to do it. So if you go back to the 2012 budget book before I got here to Glendale, our budget authorized roughly 2,350 employees was in the budget in 2012. We just cracked 2,000 employees in our last budget. So we're operating on 350 less employees today than they were in 2012 when the city was considerably smaller. And a lot of that's because we prioritize what we want to do and we've stayed really pure to that. So then as we get more revenue in, we're able to kind of come in and make that available to us for our core projects.
So, coincidentally, and I didn't. This is not planned, but I've was just recently talking to Mark Moses, who's the author of the Municipal Financial Crisis book. I don't know if you're sure if you had the pleasure of reading it, and I'm gonna actually have him on the podcast here in the very near future. But one of the things that he laments in the public sector is the creep or mission creep or broadening of the scope of government services in terms of government's always getting bigger because the scope of the services it provides is always expanding. And I was also, coincidentally talking to Chris Constantine, the San Dimas, California manager yesterday. I went out to go visit him, and we were talking about how, well, I should say, he was talking more about how his belief and priorities that government should focus more on what its core obligations are, what the core services it wants to provide, and work on doing those core things well, as opposed to doing a bunch of stuff in a mediocre fashion, right? So when you were hired on as the city manager in Glendale, did you have conversations with your governing body during that period of time or shortly after your arrival? Like, hey, I don't know, sure, were they saying, hey, we don't want to do we don't want to do a tax increase, or were they open to that? And you said, hey, no, we don't need to do that. Like, what kind of conversations do you have with a governing body when you're coming into a new organization and you have issues where you want to increase revenues? What kind of directives and feedback were you having back and forth with your governing body on that whole exchange?
Well, I've been certainly blessed to have a great council that has been in alignment with our focus on let's get our finances right and let's make sure that we do our core services well. Part of my background in terms of what steered my philosophy, I love all the Jim Collins books. And if you remember in the Good to Great book, he drew the three concentric circles that talked about if you can stay where those three circles intersect and stay in that sweet spot, those are really what the great organizations do. And the three things were, what are you passionate about? What do you have the resources to do to be the best of anybody else? And resources, what you can be the best at, and what you have a passion for. And so we've stayed within that area right there, Joe. We've just not added on a bunch of new initiatives.
So was that the council giving you sort of free rein and saying, "Hey, we don't wanna raise taxes, and so we realize we gotta cut, the services and the size of the organization," or was that you basically saying, "Hey, I think we can be proactive in terms of focusing on these core initiatives or core foundational services, and that's gonna result in us getting our organization more streamlined and efficient?"
Yeah, I think the council was good in that they just set out expectations. And like one of the expectations they had for me was when I got here in 2016, we had roughly an $18 million unassigned fund balance for our general fund. And they really wanted me to get to $50 million in our unassigned fund balance within the first 3 years of being city manager.
Okay.
And now that was based on roughly about a $270 million general fund. So at 18 million, we were woefully, not prepared. But other than that, Joe, what they did is they just said, go out and make it happen. And as our team brought forth initiatives and priorities, boy, they were just always highly supportive and have been highly supportive of our efforts.
Well, I mean, that's amazing because obviously, that's almost every city manager's dream, right? Is that basically how if you're in, especially if you're in a classic executive position as opposed to an administrator type position in your form of government. But if you're an executive, you want to have sort of free reign to run the organization as you see fit, right? As long as you're in alignment with your governing body and your governing body is not interjecting itself into the process. But to go from 2,300 employees and you're just barely crossing 2,000 now, I mean, you had to drop, I'm sure you dropped considerably below 2,000 at some point, right? So was this accomplished through any sort of layoffs or reduction in force, or was this through attrition? How did you navigate those waters?
Well, let me be clear. So there'd already been the cut before I got here. I think we
Okay.
had roughly around 1,900 employees when I got here because we were putting employees, we were furloughing employees before I got here. We had hiring freezes on, so we'd already gone through a certain amount of the kind of the bloodletting. My point being is, even though our revenues have more than doubled in the last 8 years, we've really only added on a very small percentage of new
Yes.
FTEs to support it.
Okay. And so maybe I don't know if this is contextually relevant or important, but I'm kind of curious. Back in 2016, we were not in any sort of economic hardship. We had just fully coming out. I'm sure by this time, I don't know the Phoenix Glendale metro market very well, although I know Phoenix was hammered during the Great Recession. But I would imagine by 2016, the local economy was going full blast, pretty much, or whatnot. So why was Glendale struggling in 2016 with respect to the revenue issue and the budgeting and so forth when economic times were pretty good in the region, I would think.
I think it was a carryover of maybe some kind of bad strategy and bad philosophy from prior situations. When I came here, the west part of our city, we're kind of shaped like a backwards L. And the west part of our city had a tremendous amount of land that was currently in the county, but within our municipal planning area, which means we could annex it in. And when I got to Glendale in 2016, the council philosophy was, and the administration's philosophy was, we are not going to annex in the West End because we don't want to burden our existing citizens with the cost of putting in infrastructure. And so, what I did really early on was sit down and help educate our council as to why that is not a good strategy. And so, we flipped that strategy around. And what I said is, no, let's annex. And we've annexed in thousands upon thousands of acres of land in our West End. We've not annexed in a single acre for residential. What we said is, we're going to make this our job center, our commerce area. We're going to go after large scale manufacturing, industrial, logistics. And because what I tried to help educate our council is that for every rooftop that we build in Glendale, we lose money. So when you look at the cost of providing services to a residence, be police and fire and parks and libraries and roads, et cetera, we don't gather enough revenue for that to be able to pay for it. So the only way this makes sense is that we focus on becoming a job center and attracting large businesses that will, one, pay people correctly, provide our citizens with the right kind of benefits, but make the kinds of investments that will make a difference in the community. And so a lot of this has been an educational part of the equation of sitting down and explaining how economic development works and why businesses aren't a bad thing. The kind of the terminology I use is that businesses provide an annuity check. An annuity check means you go to the mailbox every month and you open it up, and here's this check for some money, and you didn't have to do anything for it. It just keeps coming every month. And if we make good investments in economic development, that's what happens. And so we think that actually, when you compare the investment of a private sector and how hard that is compared to what we get out of the equation, we have the better part of the bargain. But I'll be honest, Joe, I've seen a lot of cities who their philosophy is that the developers and the business community are the enemy.
Yeah.
And they're greedy, and all they want is they want to take, take, take. And what I can tell you is that is not economic development. It's not subsidies. There's so many more elements to it. And at the end of the day, if you do it right, it's a real win for our citizens.
So okay, so now we're starting to get into the nitty-gritty here, Kevin, because one of the major pushbacks you'll get from people who are, anti-economic development or have some skepticism about economic development is this whole race to the bottom. We got to give a incentive of some kind for this business to locate here, and then as soon as those terms are met, they're going to bounce to another community, which is going to give them some sort of incentive to relocate and what have you. So what is your take on? I'm not sure how we should move forward with this conversation, Kevin. So I'm gonna kind of put it in your lap. Where do you? What is your overall philosophy when it comes to economic development, and how do you think city managers and local government should be approaching it? I mean, I know you touched on it a little bit here with emphasis on commercial, but not every city can actually focus on commercial, obviously.
Right. So I think one, it's there's not one size fits all when it comes to philosophy. So let me give you a couple examples. When I first came here, we have a major freeway called the Loop 101 that kind of borders our city in a couple areas, and we were going to build. The city had got a grant from the federal government to build a park and ride lot on a piece of property the city had under option adjacent to the freeway. So I showed up and I'm looking at this property and there's 150,000, 200,000 cars a day going by this property, and I'm thinking to myself, well, if I owned this property, I wouldn't make it a park and ride lot. I can guarantee you that.
Be
So
hugely undervalue the whole. Like, there's no way that would ever happen, right?
right,
I mean,
but the staff was saying, but Kevin, this won't cost us any money. The federal government's giving us all the money. And I said, no, we're going to give them the money back. We then went out and we recruited an operator to build a very large BMW dealership on that site. We literally bought the property and within a week resold it back to them at the same price we bought it at. Again, I had staff saying, well, we should make some money on the transaction. And my point was, no, what we want is the end result. So we get into the development of this
because you're
property.
thinking long term, right? You're thinking, well,
Thinking,
I don't give a damn about making a 20% or 10% return on this land sale right now. I want to get a certain type of business in onto this property. It's going to generate massive amounts of tax revenue for our organization, right?
exactly. So there's two things that happened on this one project. One, we found out that our water, we needed a redundant water line to be able to feed this commercial property because it was kind of isolated. So we agreed as a city, we had to bore under the freeway with the new water line. It was about a $700,000 project. So I went and worked with our finance team. And in that particular case, had we asked the developer to put the water line in, he would have walked away from the development. It just wouldn't have penciled out. So we agreed to come in and put a redundant water line in, knowing I could use that redundancy for other parcels that we owned. And so staff was surprised by that because we always make developers pay for all their own
Pay their
infrastructure.
way, right? Yeah.
But I said, no, we're not going to do that. Here in Arizona, there was an access road that went actually in front of the property, and it was controlled by the Arizona Department of Transportation. And BMW was requiring 3 points of ingress and egress. The only way they would award the franchise, you had to be able to show them these 3 points of ingress. Well, I'm watching email traffic for about 4 months. And it's going back and forth with our transportation folks in Arizona, back and forth, trying to decide on how we can get the ingress and egress to meet the developer's requirements. So I finally had a meeting. I brought in all my senior leadership team. There are about 10 of us in a boardroom. And I said, all right, we're going to forget for a second that we're bureaucrats. Let's pretend that we're a board of directors and that we actually own the city of Glendale. Now, I'm going to set the table for you. This dealership will generate approximately $1.2 million per year in new tax revenue to us, the 10 people here in this room. That's $100,000 a month for every month we can get this project open sooner rather than later. We get to split $100,000 in this room. Knowing that, who in this room, instead of emailing for the last 4 months back and forth with ADOT, would have gotten in their car, set up a series of meetings, and met face to face and got a solution? And very slowly, almost everybody raised their hand. They never saw time as being an
As money
issue,
or value, yeah.
and they never saw the value back to the city of Glendale. And as I kept saying to them, look, we're not having to invest $20 million to build this dealership. We're not having to hire 300 people, worry about supply chain, worry about financing changes. We just get to go to the mailbox every year and get a check for $1.2 million. Who has the best deal? And so a lot of it derives from that philosophy that we think businesses are important partners in the community. And in that particular case, we made an investment. In other cases, we haven't made any investment other than our time and our energy. And for a lot of projects, Joe, that is the real differentiator between coming to Glendale versus somewhere else.
Let's talk about that because you shared a story with me, and I forget all the particulars, and I'm not sure if you want to name names or how you want to go forward with that, Kevin, and for this story. But you were singing the praises of your staff to me about how you were able to secure or land a pretty big, might have been more than one, but I know there's specifically you had one business coming into your community, and that's because you talked about how your staff was really on the ball with streamlining the process, removing the unknowns. I think that's just something that I like to share with my audience when I can or with people in the profession. My first job out of college was working for a trading firm. We were at Chicago Board of Options Exchange, and we were trading stock options on stock. And I would tell people, you can trade bad news, you can trade good news. You can't trade when you don't know what the news is, or you have a lot of unknowns or uncertainty. And what I think a lot of the public sector, public sector executives don't fully understand is that businesses can't operate when they can't quantify the risk and the reward. So if there's a lot of unknowns, there's a lot of uncertainty, it creates a lot of stress in that process and can really sink a deal. So why don't you share kind of like how your staff did some really fine work, because that was an amazing story you shared with me.
Yeah, I think if I were going to say what is economic development, at least from my perspective, this would be a great example. So, back up early, uh, the Red Bull, which obviously international company, was going to build their first U.S. factory and production facility, and so we worked with them, and they have a partner called Roush, which is one of the largest juicers in the world, and then the Ball Corporation, which is the canning side. So we were able to build this campus of Red Bull, Rao, and Ball, built a phenomenal facility out in our West End. Then we found out that
The land that you annexed, right? The
on the
the
land
West
that
End.
we annexed, that is correct. And so then we found out that a company out of British Columbia called White Claw, which is part of the Mike's Hard Lemonade, and they've really created the hard cider marketplace. They were looking to expand and build their first U.S. factory, and they identified three locations in the U.S. And they were one in Utah and two here in Arizona. So we were working with their site selection team, but then it was coming down to where the owner of the company was going to fly down and visit the three sites and make their decision. So first thing is we researched the company really hard. And what we learned is that right now their demand for product at that time exceeded their production capability by 58 million cases annually. So we know that time is
Of
an
the essence.
incredibly important thing for them. So they first flew to Utah, then they flew in and they met with the competitor city here in Arizona, and then we were the third meeting. When they got to the first Arizona meeting, they met with the economic development director, the associate planning director, and a couple of kind of mid-level people, and they made their presentation. When they walked into our boardroom, I had every one of my senior leadership team there, including all of my department heads and directors. And the reason why is economic development sometimes is traffic, sometimes it's planning, sometimes it's utilities, but there's a lot of people who touch it. So we walked them in, and what we did is we took the time, and it took us a fair amount of time, but our econ development team built a scheduling Gantt chart that showed how we could get them open from the day they start construction to the day we issue their certificate of occupancy, that we could help them build a 1 million square foot production facility within 1 year. And they, of course, looked at us like, you're the first person that actually shows a process. Now, a lot of it, Joe, what we did is we agreed to issue permits at risk so that we could get their grading going before we knew what their foundational was going to be. We had given their foundation permit as we're still working on their structural walls. A lot of permitting departments don't want to do that, but we knew we had a good partner who was committed to doing it right. Now, at the conclusion of the meeting, we had arranged for the developer of the Red Bull facility to actually meet with the owner of White Claw to tell them about the site, because the site they were looking at was right next door to their site. So they understood the amount of power in the area. They understood utilities, soil conditions. He was very knowledgeable. And the owner of that company has done a lot of stuff in Glendale. He said, I'll be glad to give my time and to meet with them. So we then drive the owner out to the site, and literally he walks them through all the things it took to get Red Bull open. By the end of the day, White Claw had selected Glendale and selected him as the developer because he didn't know any of the developers here in
Right.
Arizona. And now some people will question this, Joe. It is the God's honest truth. He presented my team a year and a half later with a challenge coin that showed how we were able to get them open in under a year. We actually, it was like roughly around 320 some days that we were able to open up a 1 million square foot brewing facility from the day of that meeting. That wasn't from the day they broke ground. It was from the day of that meeting.
That's which is amazing, amazing.
And
It's
that's
so
economic development. And that's economic development.
so, and so there weren't any major economic incentives or anything like that tied to these projects.
Zero. We gave them, what we did is we did waive $1 million in permitting and inspection fees, but they still paid their regular diff fees for impact fees. But we just waived some of our staff time, which doesn't have a direct impact on us from a financial, but that's all they ever asked for. But they were more concerned about speed and predictability and making sure that we were fully committed to getting them successfully open in a short period of time.
See, I think that's the thing that a lot of folks lose sight of is the first tool you want to reach for in the toolbox is the economic incentive of some sort of grant or what have you, right? Some sort of lower tax rate, some sort of rebate, whatever the case is. And here you have landed a major score simply by virtue of being focused on aligning your interest with their interest and helping them get through the process as expeditiously as possible. And then on the coming out of it, you turned your partners into basically proselytizers who then went out and sang the praises of Glendale to their friends and said, "Hey, the water's warm over here. Come over here and try it out. You're gonna be impressed."
Right. There's the old saying, Joe, that what you do speaks so loud, I can't hear what you're saying. And at the end of the day, what we find, if we just produce, if we deliver the permits when we say we can, we get them through challenging designs elements. I have literally the world's best building manager in terms of his ability to find creative ways to build something within code when you reach a kind of a challenge or a bottleneck. And so having that team that has the flexibility to be creative in how we help facilitate projects on what our philosophy is that we want to be a facilitator, not a regulator. Now, the difference is really very minor. In both cases, you have to follow by the building code and you have to build things correctly. A regulator mentality says when you got the solution, come back and I'll approve it. When you have a facilitator mindset, you sit down with them and you say, let's figure out a solution together on this. So there becomes ownership within our planning team that it's part of their responsibility to help find a solution. I've had numerous arguments with many city managers, and I respect them dearly, but they will tell you, oh, we can never be the one offering solutions because if something goes wrong, they'll want to come back and they'll just sue the city. And so we run economic development because of a risk manager mentality and not because of the bigger picture of what it can do for your community.
Well, what is your response or rebuttal to that, though? Well, we do live in a litigious society, Kevin. So what do you make of that?
At the end of the day, their design team is going to stamp all their plans. And so, the fact that we made recommendations for them to maybe possible solutions, we don't think puts our organization at any kind of a risk because at the end of the day, they still have to design it and the engineer and their architects have to stamp it off.
And I would go even a step further and say that the message that the Glendale team sends to the private sector businesses, right, that are trying to mitigate risk as much as possible, and they're trying to move through the process as expeditiously as possible, right? Because they want to get going because that's the fundamental difference between the private and the public sector is the public sector seems to can't be bothered with the time, and the private sector just can't move fast enough. And I think what I find really frustrating about my experiences in working with the public sector, not necessarily in small town Kansas, because I didn't have much economic development to work on in small town Kansas, right? But and working on a variety of other issues outside of economic development is how do we find the yes? And I feel like too often in government, we're focused on why we can't do something instead of how do we figure out a way to get it done. And I think that if you have a staff who is empowered to provide that sort of direction or guidance or feedback to your private sector partners, it just engenders a certain amount of goodwill and working relationships because okay, we're all rowing in the same direction trying to make this work. We understand the win that's going to happen for you as a private business and you're going to make profit and so forth and so on. And we also know we're going to benefit as a city.
Yes.
And
So can I share a story? So
yeah,
when I was an elected official, I was still very much embedded in the private sector world. And I'm going to kind of generalize to a degree, but what I learned is this. So let's take in my business. Let's say I had an employee been with me for 20 years and was a highly producing employee, but let's say made a mistake that really upset my biggest customer. And it was, somewhat significant. As a rule, as an owner of that company, I would bring that employee in based on their 20 years of success, and we would make sure that we don't repeat the issue and we would work our way through it, but the person would stay employed. Now, over the last 20 years, if that employee hadn't produced it all, they would have been long gone anyway. Now, it's almost what I learned in government. If you're not careful, it can be almost backwards, meaning this: you can have a long career in government as an employee, as long as, heaven forbid, you never embarrass a department head, the city manager, or the council. So what happens is, so you can just be average and you will have a long time career. So that's why it becomes very easy for people to say no, because
yes.
I'm going to say no. And if the client doesn't like it, if the builder, the developer doesn't like it, they'll just bounce it up to my boss. I'll let my boss take the hit for it. And so what I try to tell my team and what I've empowered them to do is this: is your city manager has limited skills. And I say that and not feigning humility, but I have my limited skills. One thing I'm really good at, however, is I know how to jump in front of a bus. And so what I want them to do is I want them to go out, I want them to lean into this job. We're not striving for perfection. We're striving for excellence, which means along the road to excellence, you're going to make mistakes. And if something happens that embarrasses the council or brings attention to the organization, they have my assurance that I will be the one to step up and say, I take responsibility for this. And so that empowers staff then to be creative, to look for solutions. They know they don't have somebody looking over their shoulder saying, "Why did you do this?" We're just always trying to push the envelope forward. And the kind of the side benefit is that employees love being in that kind of environment, and they work harder, they get more creative, and they take even more ownership just by saying, I'm going to be there for you. I'm going to protect I'm going to protect any mistake you may come up with.
Is that because when you say they take more ownership, and I know exactly what you mean in the grand sense, but I'm wondering also, what do you assign that to, Kevin? Like, is it the idea that I, as a public servant working in the economic development department for Glendale, that I came up with this idea or I helped facilitate this, and there's a sense of pride and accomplishment in that? Where does the ownership come from when you talk about the actual human ethos in your department? Because this leads into another question that I want to have, that I don't know if you feel comfortable answering or not, but compensation. Because I find public compensation models to be woefully inadequate when it comes to incentivizing performance. So,
Yeah, so going back to kind of that recognition or ownership part of it is one, and I love my econ development team, but I don't see them. They just have a role, but we really include everybody in the success. So when we do a ribbon cutting or a groundbreaking, we make an announcement. We do it as an organization because what I've learned is the guy that really was the miracle worker might have been that traffic engineer that figured out a solution to a decel lane that made this project stay on track and on schedule or on budget. But they never get invited to the patting of the back ceremony. It's always the director of economic development or the city manager. So, one, we share in the organizational success across the board. And what our employees hear a lot from their city manager are the wins as an organization that we're getting, not wins that I did or the economic development department did, but wins as an organization. So that makes it really easy, I think, for people to have ownership in it. And again, we educate them. This is where our revenue comes from. And this allows us to compensate you correctly. This allows us to invest in your training and the equipment you need. But we all need to have ownership of economic development.
do you? So I don't wanna I'm not gonna put you on the spot and have you talk about your specific organization, I guess, but what are your thoughts right now when it comes to private sector and public compensation? And I don't just mean at the executive levels, but I mean at the employee level, because one of the things I find very frustrating about the public sector is getting back to what you just said a moment ago about almost incentivized to say no and the risk averse, is that compensation, generally speaking, compensation models do not reward. In fact, they disincentivize people taking risk within the organization that's going to produce these exceptional rewards and value to the organization. Having been in the private sector for many years, having been an elected official, now in the chair as a city manager of a major organization, what are your thoughts on public sector compensation? And do you see this any sort of evolution coming down the pike in the next decade?
Well, on the downside, you're right. We can't we can't provide extra incentive for delivering a project on time. That is certainly a negative. But on the positive side is there's been extensive research done a lot by Gallup, which talks about the factors of why people enjoy their job. And what's really fascinating is that of the top seven factors of why people like their job, compensation is number five. The first is recognition. The second is challenge. Well, those are things we can do if we're deliberate. We've got all kinds of challenges. That's pretty easy. And the recognition part, we just have to be more mindful of. And again, the one thing I don't like about a government environment is we're too hierarchical in terms of our power. Everyone looks at the top of the food chain.
Right.
And so you have to reverse that upside down. We have to eliminate some of the narcissism that creeps into government, and really value those people that are really making things happen. If you do those things correctly and you share the wins as an organization, The compensation part will never be like it is in the private sector side, but you can still have employees that are incredibly skilled and incredibly gifted and committed to the organization.
Not to make you the subject of any dartboards, Kevin, but with the success that you've had in Glendale over the last 8, 9 years, do you find it um, easier to recruit talent from other organizations within the Metroplex, or how's that been going for you guys when it comes to these successes? And I guess getting back to just sort of like what you just said, the fundamentals of creating satisfied, highly engaged employees, giving them the autonomy, empowering them, right, with the responsibilities of moving forward and creating solutions, finding solutions. What has that been like for you guys?
One of the other huge responsibilities I think that a city manager should take on and be very deliberate about is the fact that you're really the chief culture officer in the organization. And it's really the culture that you're trying to establish because that speaks to your kind of point, Joe, about about attracting and retaining talent. And it's so much of it's culture driven, especially in government where our compensation isn't wildly different between, say, us and Mesa or Phoenix or Surprise, other cities here in the valley, but the culture can vary considerably. And so we work really hard of really creating a work environment that is, I would say, very informal and very casual in terms of relationships. I try to be deliberate in terms of accessibility of my time and my senior leadership time. But I was shocked my first week in Glendale. My office looked out at where the receptionist desk was for our office suite, and all my directors had already met me, but for the first week or 2, my directors would come into the office suite, and they'd go up to my assistant, Amy, and say, "Hey, Amy, can I go talk to Kevin for a second?" And I'm kinda going like, "Well, my door's open, there's nobody in my office, why do you need permission to come in and to say hi?" But the reality was, the prior culture was you never went in and talked to the city manager or even addressed the city manager without really that person addressing you first. That's the kind of culture that can really hurt organizations. And so we really have been deliberate about about how we do it. So we're redoing our city hall. So it's about $100 million project. It'll be done in 26. I moved the city manager suite off of the top floor. I also in that building, every fixed office will be internal to the building and not against a window, because again, I don't want this corner office mentality creeping into how we manage and how we lead the organization. So, one, I think our best salespeople for getting a talent from the outside really is the culture that we've been able to put together. And I've got great senior leaders and directors that they just mimic that and do a wonderful job of creating a great environment for their employees.
Hearing you say that, it kind of reminds not well listening to you just tell me now about the culture and the impact of culture. We always talk about this in the grand scheme of things, but just a thought just popped in my head, and this is nothing earth shattering. It's nothing crazy insightful, but I think about all these organizations that are going through constant turnover of the city manager position, right? We read about them all the time. The city that's gone through 4 city managers in 8 years or something like that, and it's so debilitating. It's so expensive from an actual dollar terms, but also just from an indirect cost of financial and the toll and the stress on staff to go through all that turnover. And you talk about the importance of culture in your organization. It just boggles my mind that so many elected officials are so willing to churn and burn through their city managers. It just I don't know.
No, you're spot on. You're spot on, Joe.
It's just I don't know, it frustrates the hell out of me, Kevin. Like when I see I don't get it. It's like it's just sort of a lack of a fundamental lack of understanding when it comes to organizational behavior and dynamics. And I wish some of these elected officials across the country would kind of wake up and realize the big game, the big picture, the macro picture when it comes to running an organization, having a city manager, empowering that city manager who can empower staff and create that culture to get the excellent results like you've gotten in Glendale.
Yeah, our team, I learned really quickly, was shell shocked when I got to Glendale. They had 5 city managers, whether interim or permanent, within 36 months. And so everybody was looking over their shoulder. And I think very few people saw Glendale as the long game for them. I think they were just holding on for dear life. And so bringing that stability in, and again, we talk a lot to our employees about how financially, how we're doing, because I want them not to ever worry about whether or not we're going to go into furloughs or whether we won't be able to kind of stay competitive, with that. In fact, I'll be announcing to our at our all annual meeting that we'll have in January that going from that $18 million that we had in our unreserved fund balance, we finished off June 30th of this year. Now, this again is not raising any taxes, focusing on revenue the right way, which is through growing economic development. We will finish with a $318 million reserve balance in our general fund. We're paying cash for our remodel of City Hall. We've got a bunch of major projects going on with our parks expansion, and we're using cash to pay for them. And so we'll communicate that to our employees because we want them feeling this is a home for me for the long term. And this organization's making good decisions financially, which means they'll continue to invest in me as an employee.
How are you able to maintain this sort of dynamic with your governing body? And this might be veering off into part two of how I wanted to have this our interview go, but maybe I guess we'll do a little teaser. Kevin is like, how do you maintain this sort of momentum and culture as you have new elected officials coming aboard every couple of years on an election cycle? I assume you've had some turnover since you've been there for 8 9 years.
Well, actually, this December we'll have the most amount of turnover. We'll have two new council members coming in, but for the most part, I've had the core seven, the mayor and six council members. I've only had two people in my 8 years until this December.
No
So,
kidding.
so that's been really
Wow.
good. Now, what I will say is this: I think if cities do a good job, if management leads the organization, and we meet the needs of our citizens, and we do that really well, that elections at the local level are generally a barometer of how the community as a whole envisions City Hall. So, in other words, you might have a council member that was totally against economic development. But if the core said we want to invest in economic development, it's proven to be successful. Even that naysayer gets the benefit at election time as being part of something that's good that is happening. When you make bad decisions and when you lose the confidence and trust of your community, I've seen the best elected officials get elected out of the office because everybody gets painted with the same paintbrush. So, first and foremost, we have to stay focused on meeting the needs of our community and making sure that we're doing our job. Everything else, it doesn't matter if you're not doing your job.
Right, right, absolutely. So, kind of getting back into the whole economic development, because I don't want to veer off too far in that lane. I want to save that for a future episode. What do you consider if you were to rank the keys for success? And I know you said earlier that economic development for one city is not always going to be the same as for another as far as philosophical approaches. But generally speaking, at a macro level, what do you identify as the key factors for having a successful economic development program or getting results in that area? What do you think that every organization should aspire to have or maintain in order to be successful?
Well, I think one, you have to take economic development as a priority and take it out of the strategic planning book or off the wall and put it into action. So let me give you a quick story. So when I first got elected to the Tacoma City Council, the council knew I kind of was coming in from a business perspective. So the city manager there put together a 2-day retreat to really focus the organization on what we wanted to get accomplished in the next couple of years. And we walked into the conference room. I'll never forget, on three walls, we had a sign. One said public safety, one said neighborhoods, and the other said economic development. And the staff and the city manager and the mayor stood up and said, "These are our three priorities." So we get through the 2 days and we were kind of wrapping things up. And so when it came time for me, I'm the new guy in the block, so I wasn't talking as much as I'm talking today. And the I said, "Well, I think we need to take economic development off the wall as a priority." And everybody looked at me and said, "Well, what are you talking about? You're the economic development guy."
You're the private sector guy. They must have been shocked when you said that.
I said, "Well, it's not a priority." And I had the big budget binder, 3-ring binder of our budget. I threw it down in front of the table, in the middle of the table, and said, "Show me in this document where economic development is a priority, because you fund your priorities." And that was my point. And so they didn't even have an economic development department in when I joined the city council in 1998. That's one of the first things we did is we started funding our priorities. So I would say first and foremost, it doesn't have to be money, but you have to at least invest your time and resource into making economic development a priority. You have to talk about it, you have to look for opportunities, and it needs to start at the absolute highest level in the organization. And it can't be pawned off onto somebody else.
Okay. All right. Then where do you rank then economic incentives? The classic, I know there's all different types of incentives. Where do you rank incentives as far as on that equation of importance?
I would say again, each one's different, and you need to look at it from a return on investment side. So I'll kind of fast forward to a project that I've been working on for almost 4 years. We have a developer building a resort property here in Glendale that is going to turn the resort world upside down. And Arizona has great resorts, but this thing is going to be unbelievable. It'll be the state's largest resort, about 1,100 rooms. It's about a $1.1 billion investment. And part of it, they're building a 13,000 seat amphitheater that attaches to the hotel. So your hotel room becomes a suite. Mattel Adventure Park is building on one end. They got a big lagoon in the middle. But the point being this, we ended up giving this developer, we waived about $6 million in permit fees. And I've had some people in the community and a couple of my council members question whether that's a wise investment. We hired a independent firm called Applied Economics to do an economic study on when this resort opens up. And what they said is when this resort gets fully operational for the first 25 years, the city will generate $32.4 million a year in new revenue just to the city of Glendale. So, my question is, Joe, if it was your money, would you invest $6 million of waiving permit fees to get a dividend check of $32.4 million for the next 25 years?
It's the biggest no-brainer in the history of mankind.
Right. So, what I try to do is let's treat this as if it's our money. Would you make this investment? Forget about the optics. We understand occasionally we'll have citizens that just don't understand incentives. But you have to still tie it to a return on investment. You don't want to just give out a $1 million incentive to generate $100,000 a year in return. So I think you have to analyze it, have good numbers, and and invest in those things that can really be transformative for the city.
Agreed. Well, obviously want to maximize that leverage. I think that's one of the things that a lot of electeds and folks in the public sector don't fully understand. Myself having worked in the financial markets is leverage, right? How to leverage a certain amount of money or a certain financial instrument in order to get value or leverage this. And by the way, not all incentives have to be financial, right? There's other types of incentives that you can do to, like I said, expedite the process or what have you. What about on any maybe not necessarily war stories or horror stories in Glendale, but what have you seen over the years that you feel like, oh, that's just not really a good practice when it comes to economic development? Have you seen anything that you'd like to share?
Yeah, I would say, and please forgive me to all my transportation people out there, but I've seen traffic engineers kill more economic development projects than in just about anything in my municipal career. And we empower our traffic engineer. They usually operate outside of the kind of the bright lights of what goes on. And yet the decisions they make in terms of requiring certain kinds of off-street improvements and signalization and all those things, it can kill more good deals than you can shake a stick at. And I when I first got here, I come from the Seattle area. We have Starbucks in every corner. We have a huge entertainment district here where the stadiums are at, and we didn't have an espresso store. And so I'm trying to say, why can't we get somebody that sells drive-through espresso? a company out of Oregon called Dutch Brothers, which has
Yep.
been doing really well. They were looking at a site on the corner entering into our entertainment district. And I found out was our traffic engineer had turned it down because for them to do an egress out of the site was too close to the intersection by design standards. And so he said, no, you can't, we don't want to have anybody on a major arterial. Driveway cuts need to be 300 feet or more. And so that deal was had gone away. And I looked at my traffic engineer and I said, "So I'm new to Glendale." I was playing dumb. I said, "I'm new to
Right.
Glendale. If I drive down Glendale Avenue, are you telling me I won't find any circumstances of driveways being closer than 300 feet?" And they said, "Oh no, we have a lot of circumstances where they're closer than 300 feet." I said, "Oh, now you got me really nervous. Now you're telling me I shouldn't be sleeping very well at night because we've made our citizens unsafe here in Glendale." And they said, "Oh no, they're safe." And then they caught themselves and they realized it. And I said, "Bingo." Yes, it's yeah. Ideally, in a design book, you say 300 feet on a this particular circumstance. We need to figure out a way to make this work. By the way, Dutch Brothers is there. They do phenomenal business. They've been a great add addition to our entertainment district, and we haven't had any accidents coming out of the Dutch Brothers that I know of.
So Kevin, I have a question. I'm not sure if I've this question formulated in my brain, but it's something I wrestle with a little bit as somebody who considers themselves a limited government, right of center individual, politically speaking, entrepreneurial, innovative, and I've come into the public sector late in my career, and I look at things and I go, man, I think we could really be entrepreneurial in this regard or innovative here. And I sometimes wonder, is that really the place where government should be going, right? Like, if because sometimes government does things it shouldn't be doing, and I mean, I mean, stuff on politically speaking, things I'm not a fan of per se, philosophically speaking. But I'm also wondering sometimes, are there things that we do on the economic development side that are kind of beyond the scope of government too, and we start to get a little bit too innovative or too creative because we have this private sector mentality or approach? Does that make sense? What I'm asking?
Yeah, I'm not sure if they necessarily get outside of their lane, but I will say that I think in government sometimes as an organization, because we do so many things that are complex, that we think we can do it all. And so I think really where I would push back on is say, and for example, we here in Glendale, we have what's called the Desert Diamond Arena. It's a 18,000 seat arena. It used to be the home of the Arizona Coyotes, and then we parted ways with them a few years ago because they, in our opinion, weren't a good partner for our community. Not too long ago, it was being managed by one of the largest arena managers in the world. ASM Global was our arena manager. And I sat down with their senior leadership and said, you know what? I don't think the city should own these kinds of facilities. I think the private sector can do so much better managing and owning this kind of arena because you know exactly where to invest money, you know how to market it, you know how to attract the talent and the shows that are there. And so over the period of about 6 months, we negotiated the sale of our arena to ASM Global. And in the 2 years since they have acquired the arena, they have had absolute record revenue years, smashing one year by almost double from a previous year. And our entertainment district has benefited from all of the activity taking place in the economic area. Now, let's rewind back to 2000. In Tacoma, we have what's called the Tacoma Dome. It's a 20,000 seat wood dome that can do both football and basketball. I made a proposal to my council to sell the Tacoma Dome and get out of owning that business and get it in the hands of a promoter that can do shows and do major things. And I was laughed out of the room by my colleagues because government doesn't sell. And so, there's a little bit of arrogance that says we can do it all. I don't believe so. So we found the right scenario for us. We've divested ourselves of the arena. They now have every incentive to drive as much content through and as many events as possible through. It's been a great marriage. Not exactly answering your question or your point, Joe, but I think staying in that lane is really important.
Kevin, it's one of those things where I look at, even when we venture off into, say, private sector partnerships, when we look at privatization of certain resources versus taking it on, I- there's a lot of examples, and again, I'm sounding really inarticulate right now, but at the end of the day, I look at some of these situations and I think, oh, I'm a smart guy. I think I could do this better if we did this in house. But yet, philosophically speaking, from the school of thought that I come from, being, my youth and my college experience, it was like, oh well, we should be privatizing everything and getting out into the out in the private sector, because the private sector is more efficient, more effective at marshaling these resources and what have you. But then we go through a period of time over the last couple of years with the COVID fallout, and the pandemic, and inflation, and I look at some of the things that's going on in the private sector, and I think, man, I think we could do that better, more efficiently in the public sector. I look at, like, for example, in Florida, for example, they've had some hellacious issues with waste hauling contracts that have just been skyrocketing. It's like, well, maybe the city should be taking that in house instead of allowing that to be done in the private sector. I don't know. It's been a really interesting time over the last few years, because historically speaking, I've been pro privatization, but then I've seen inefficiencies in the market. I think I've seen holes in the market that suggest maybe privatization isn't always the best course of action. And I know we're being very general and very simplistic in this conversation, and it's hard to do without getting into the nitty gritty of a specific case study. But you tracking me on that? When
Well, yeah,
this weird?
let me be a counter to that a little bit. Let me
Okay.
kinda jump in on behalf of, city managers out there, because I came from the private sector with the mindset that the private sector delivers a lot more value than what government is bloated, it's
Yes.
wasteful, lazy employees. So I did an exercise, earlier this year, because I think sometimes in city management and in local government, we're apologetic about the taxes and the fees that we charge. In fact, we never bring them up voluntarily. We only discuss taxes when we're forced to talk about them. So what I did is I asked our finance department to take every bit of revenue for the prior year that we generate. So that included our sales tax, called TPT. We included our property tax, our rental excise tax, our we get things like our license fees and permit fees. I took even our things like our water revenue for our water department, and I took our solid waste revenues for our landfill and for our refuse hauling. Every bit of revenue, whatever it is, we just put it into a pot. And then what I did is I divided that amount out on a per capita basis. So, Joe, here's what I found out. The city of Glendale offers, if you are a Glendale resident, I can look you in the eye and say this: we will provide you 24/7 police, fire, and EMS. We won't take any days off. We're gonna provide you with 2,650 lane miles of streets and arterials with several hundred controlled intersections and over 1,000 traffic signs. We have 71 parks in Glendale. We have 4 libraries. We have 5 community centers, numerous athletic fields. Every day you turn your water on, you're going to get clean water with a 100-year supply of water in our reserves. When you get your garbage, you put it out every week, and a truck's going to come by and it's going to pick up that garbage and your recycling. Once a month, you can put absolutely anything in front of your house, and our bulk hauling department will come in, will pick up the bulk hauling no matter what it is. We will then bring a street sweeper, and once a month, we sweep every street in the city of Glendale. We have a litter crew that goes around and picks up litter at every major arterial. We have code enforcement, et cetera, et cetera. You know what that costs, Joe?
How
We
much?
It breaks down to $162 per person per month in the city of Glendale. Now you tell me who in the private sector can deliver anywhere near that kind of value. Now, no offense to Starbucks, but I can't go to Starbucks and get my morning latte every day of the month and
For less than
spend
that?
for less than that. I have a
Yeah.
hard time joining a club. My HOA dues are more than that. And so I think we're at this point to where we need to pivot away from being embarrassed about what we charge and flip that turntable around and say what we need to do is educate our citizens of the great value that we provide, and be bold to talk about the taxes we charge, be bold to talk about those things. And I think if you take the time to do that, almost every citizen that I've walked through that scenario, their jaw drops open and goes, "I had no idea."
You said it better than I could say it right there, Kevin. So I'm going to end this podcast right there on that. I think you made a very compelling case for the public sector, for the government services that we provide. Kevin Phelps, City Manager for the City of Glendale, Arizona. Thank you for being our guest today. I am Joe Turner. This is the City Manager Unfiltered podcast, a podcast for city managers and other public sector executives. It is the most influential local government podcast in America, and I will catch you next week. Thank you.